Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at how to answer questions in biology. And often we spend a huge amount of time learning all of the content, but we're a little bit uncertain as to how best to answer these questions. And we are going to look at some examples and how best to break up the questions so you know exactly what you need to answer to get your full marks. In biology, we often set many of our questions based off of diagrams. And on the screen here now, I've just provided a multitude of ideas that normally teachers will use in order to answer questions based off of what you see. And we have things like, for example, different kinds of transport in substances. We have perhaps an experimental setup. In this one over here, we have a dihybrid cross, which is one that you would calculate and work out. Maybe you'll have a labeling question and a diagram. But the thing that all of these pictures have in common is the way in which we ask the questions as examiners and teachers. And this video will give you some insight into what does the question want from you. First of all, let's look at analyze. And when we say we want to analyze something, what we're referring to is to examine and then interpret what we see. And so there's some key things to look for when we want to answer these questions. First of all, how are we going to answer an analyze question? Well, generally, analyze questions come with some kind of graph or diagram. I've used a graph alongside with some female reproductive system hormones in it to just illustrate what I mean by this. And essentially, you need to study what you're looking at. If it's a graph, you need to look at when it's going up and down and essentially why it's doing that. And what you need to do is you need to explain what you see by providing reasons. Now, often you'll be able to see what's happening in the graph, but you would need to have studied to know why it's happening. In other words, providing those reasons. And when you analyze a graph, you must only explain what you see. Don't pretend like you can see things in the graph just because you saw them previously in a textbook or when you did activities in class. So an example question that we could work through is analyze the trend of the graph. And what they want you to do is they want to speak about the trend. In other words, the pattern that we see in this graph. So perhaps if we look alongside very quickly and we look at perhaps just the ovulation hormones, you'll notice that both of these hormones are fairly low in amount. So you can say over time, the trend of the hormones is to remain quite low. However, around day 12 to 14, there is a dramatic spike, and then the hormones drop off after the point of ovulation. Now, I've told you what I can see, but it's also really important to provide reasons why these hormones have gone up and down, and that will give you your entire answer for the word analyze. Next, we move on to classify. And essentially, classify is grouping things based on a common characteristic. Now, there are a couple of ways that this can be asked, and I'm going to just use one in which we're looking at how we classify based off of a diagram that they may have presented you. So, how do we answer classifying questions? First of all, you need to classify whatever they want you to classify based off the diagram they've provided. Now, alongside here, I have what we call a cladogram. It is a diagram which represents how land plants have been classified into their groups and certain evolutionary points that tell us changes in their classification. Now, it's important to note that sometimes in a classify question, you cannot see everything in the diagram they've given. So you will need to know these off by heart. They would have been part of your studying regime. An example question perhaps to look at would be something like classify the following plant into its class. And they'd provide you a picture of a plant, and then they want to use this diagram alongside to tell us exactly where that plant would lie within this classification. And of course, you need to know a little bit, but you can also use the picture as a guide. Next, we have compare. And when we compare, we are either going to show some similarities or some differences between structures, processes, or organisms. So, how to answer a compare question? Well, often it's in a table format, but not always. It can also be a paragraph. But it's important that your comparisons are very clear. In other words, when you talk about one structure, you need to speak about that structure and how it's different in something else. In other words, it must read very clearly, or that your comparisons must complement each other. So, for example, if we use our table alongside next to us here, if you're going to talk about cells, not having a cell wall, then the other difference on the other side must complement that, and it needs to say has a cell wall. And so our example question is compare the differences between an animal and plant cell. And essentially, you could draw a table for this, but sometimes it's a paragraph answer. When you write your answers, make sure that when you do these comparisons that you are comparing one to the other and that the comparisons match. For example, if you're going to compare the walls, you must compare both of them. You cannot say, has a cell wall, a plant cell, and animal cells don't have vacuoles. That doesn't make sense. It's not a comparison. We need to know what both has or doesn't have. Next up, we have define. And define literally means giving a clear meaning to some kind of terminology. And what they'll do in tests and exams is they will give you a word and they want you to define it. But now here's the thing. Definitions are very specific. And so this is one of the few times where I would say to you, you need to know your words, your terminology, and their definitions off by heart, particularly when we speak about laws and principles, because they're fixed. And that's why I'm using this example of Mendel's laws of inheritance. These you don't want to go off book and make them up as you go along. You definitely need to stick to what your textbook is saying, especially if you want to get full marks for the definition. For an example, just to break down the first law, the law of segregation, if you are writing out this law word for word, that would be great. But sometimes you can't remember it word for word. So it's important that you put in the most defining terminology. And that would be something like 2 alleles for each gene, and I'm stressing the each there, are placed in different gametes. These 6 words are critical to this definition and to this law. And even small words like the words different and each, even though they don't necessarily form a term or scientific term, if you leave them out, you run the risk of getting the law or the principle incorrect. And so for defining, we want to keep these as specific as possible and try your best to keep them as close to the textbook. Next up, we have describe. Now, describe is when we are going to state in words the main points of a structure, a process, or some kind of phenomenon. Now, in exams and tests, this normally takes the form of a much longer answer. We're looking at 6, 8, 12 marks maybe, perhaps even an essay. And describe has numerous components that must be in your answer in order to get full marks. And these are the following. We have the where, the why, the when, and the what. Now, I know this seems very obvious that this is what you would need to give in a description, but often we forget how we apply these things. So when we're describing a structure, process, or a phenomenon, we need to say, where is this process taking place? Why is this process taking place? When is it taking place? And what exactly is this process? Now, to make this a little bit easier for us, I'm going to use an example like fertilization so that you can see how you would answer the question, describe fertilization. So let's apply this now. Describe fertilization. So first things first, where is it happening? Fertilization is happening in the fallopian tubes. Why is it happening? In order to form a zygote so that we can reproduce a diploid organism. Then we need to speak about when it happens. It occurs after ovulation because there needs to be an egg present, and once ejaculation has taken place, because that's how we would get the sperm cells into the female body. And then lastly, what has happened? This is where the nucleus of a sperm cell is going to fuse with the nucleus of the ovum, forming a diploid zygote. Now, these are obviously very short, concise sentences, and you would probably be writing this in a paragraph. So you'd need to link these sentences together to one another. But this would roughly be about a 4 to 6 mark answer. Of course, the older you are and the higher the grade you are in, you would need to give a much more detailed answer. And you would know that because in your class, you would have more terminology to use. I'm yet again going to say that terminology is your best friend when it comes to answering questions in life sciences. The better your terminology is, the better you will do in life sciences. That's really the secret. Now let's look into the word explain. Now, when we speak about explaining something, we need to provide a reason for a statement that you have made. And often you are going to formulate your answer around the what and the why. Now, explain and describe are often confused with one another. So let's do an example on exactly the same topic, but let's look at how the answer would be different. Let's explain fertilization. So, if we were going to explain fertilization, we would say something like haploid sperm cell nucleus fuses with a haploid ovum nucleus. You'll notice there's a lot of emphasis on the terminology in these answers. As I've said before, terminology is really important when you are explaining or describing something. And then we give a reason, the why. Well, we want to form a diploid zygote. This answer is much shorter than the describe question, and often these questions are out of 2 to 4 marks. Depending on how many reasons you have to give, this will be a fairly short answer compared to the describe, which will be much longer. The next question word that we often come across is determine. And when they're asking you to determine something, what they're asking you to do is to examine that thing in the test. Generally, you are provided with either a graph or a picture. And what you need to do is you need to determine what you are looking at. Generally, these pictures or diagrams are not labeled, and there's very little clues that are given in terms of names. So what you need to do is you need to look at the physical structures of whatever it is in front of you and determine what it is. Let's look at an example of how you would do this. Let's say, for example, they had given you this diagram of a micrograph of a epithelial tissue. All they've said is that this is some kind of epithelial tissue or mammalian tissue, but they haven't given you any other information. And the question is asking you to determine what it is. So it's important that when we are determining things, we are looking for characteristics. We're looking for things that are definite, that are really defined in pictures, things that are really going to stand out. And when we look at these kind of pictures here and we're determining things, we're going to look at some very let's call them obvious things in the picture. And if you've been studying tissues, as an example, you will notice that there are certain structures that seem to stand out. First of all, you're looking at shapes of things. You'll notice that these cells have a certain shape to them. So that's a characteristic you're looking for. You'll notice the nucleus has a certain shape. That's a characteristic. One of the defining things you'll notice that is it seems as though all of these cells seem to be placed in circular patterns with an empty hole in the center. And these are all characteristics of the cells and how you arrange them. But then let's take a step further, because we call these visible reasons. And when you are giving a visible reason in an exam, you need to give what you can see. In other words, you can't just make up your answer. You have to provide a visible reason for why you have identified it the way you have. Moving on to differentiate. Now, differentiate literally means we're going to tell the difference between something. And the answers that you may be asked to give will often take different formats. The most common format is a table, but sometimes it's a list where you have to list the differences. Or an alternative question is, for example, like the one I've used down here, they may give you a diagram. Here we have a plant cell and an animal cell, and they'll say differentiate between these two cells. What they're asking for is, how do you tell the difference between these two? What physical things can you look for in this diagram that we've given you to tell the difference? Now, an example of what your answer may look like is something like this table that I have up here, where we have the differences between fungi and protists. It's really important, and this is a little extra tip, that when you differentiate one organism from another or one structure from another, that your differences must read right to left. In other words, if we look at our table as an example, you will notice that we speak about something like our size of our cell. You need to make sure that both of the answers under fungi and protist reference size. This one is visible and this one is microscopic. You can't, for example, mix answers. In other words, if we look at another answer in that table, you can't speak about the cell membrane. And under fungi, you say chitinous cell membrane. But then instead of writing variable, as in it's different, you write something like aerobic or anaerobic respiration.
It doesn't make sense. It must read left to right. If you're going to talk about cell membrane qualities, you're going to talk about them in both of the columns. If you're going to talk about how it respires, it must be the same for what you say for the fungi as you say for the protist. In other words, when you read your table or your differences left to right, they must complement one another. You can't mix up your differences. Next, we move on to discuss. Now, discuss is definitely a difficult question, often because it's such a lengthy answer you're going to have to give. And most importantly, it's going to consider all the information you know about this topic, and you're going to have to come to a conclusion. And this can be quite challenging. This is going to truly test whether or not you can take all of the information that you have about a topic, write it in a coherent, well-synthesized piece of work, and then come to a conclusion, come to a decision. Let's look at a question to see how you would do this. Now, this seems like a very simple question on the face value, but this is a fairly lengthy answer that you could give depending on the grade level that you're in as well. But the question is, discuss the effects cloning has on a genome. Now, before you dive into your opinion and what effect it may have, it's important to let the marker understand and know that you know what cloning is and you know what a genome is. So this is how I would structure the answer for a question like this. So we're going to start off with describing these key terms, the cloning and the genome. This makes sure that the marker knows exactly what these are and that you know what they mean. Then you're going to go into explaining how these processes work. In other words, explain how cloning works. Perhaps the question is a little bit more specific. Maybe it's embryonic cloning, reproductive cloning, or therapeutic. Maybe it's a specific kind that you have to speak about. If it's just in general, then you can speak about the process in a general way. Likewise, genomes and how they work is also important to explain how genomes exist, how they may change over time, and as you can see, this can get quite lengthy. Stick to the mark allocation and also remember your grade level and how much detail you may need to provide from what you've learned. Then you need to go into describing the positives and negatives. If there is perhaps positives and negatives, provide them. In other words, you're giving the pros and cons. What are the pros? What are the cons? In other words, what are the positive effects of cloning on the genome? What are the negative effects on our genome when cloning? And lastly, now that you've discussed these key terms, the processes, and the positive and negatives, you have to come to some kind of conclusion based on the evidence that you have provided. And as you can see, you're ultimately formulating an answer that is constructed around the evidence and the knowledge that you have on the topic. Now, depending on how much you know and how well you formulate your whole discussion, it'll make it easier or more difficult to come to a conclusion. Often, these kinds of essays or longer paragraphs are marked a little bit more strictly because we want to see if you can synthesize knowledge, which basically means taking everything you've learned and formulating a response. The next question pretty much speaks for itself. Identify and label. And what that essentially means is you're going to name the essential characteristics you may see and identify structures. And an obvious, easy question that you may get is to identify and label, in this case, the heart. And so when they're meaning identify, they don't necessarily mean you have to point and locate it. What they mean is look at the diagram, look at the labels, be very specific at what the label is pointing at, and provide a label for it. Often these questions are asking labels for structures, sometimes processes, and you've got to be really, really detail oriented. In other words, you need to look very carefully at exactly where the label lines are touching. It's important to note whether the label line is in the center of a structure. Is it touching the very edge of the structure? Is it getting closer to something, further away? These are small subtleties in labels, but often this is why we get things wrong, is because we're not looking very carefully at what the label is actually touching. Now, these are all straight label lines. Sometimes in exams, you may experience perhaps a curly bracket like this one over here. Essentially, that kind of label is asking for the whole structure. Sometimes you'll see a curly bracket next to a few labels, and that might be because you have to tell me what the collective name is for all of these labels together. This is a fairly easy question, and you should be getting as many marks as possible for these types of questions, as they are simply recall questions. The next question words we want to talk about is name and state. And they're actually very, very similar. And in some exams, they're basically interchangeable with one another. But essentially, name and state means you're going to give the name of something. You're going to write it down without any further discussion. Now, what's tricky about these questions is the following. If they say name 3 factors contributing to global warming, it's really important that, number 1, you only give 3, but number 2, you don't give 4 or 5 or more, because when they say name 3, they're going to mark the first 3 and ignore the rest of your answers. So let's say hypothetically, you gave 4 answers instead of 3. Let's say that the first 2 answers are incorrect of the 4, but the last 2 are correct. But the question said give 3. Now the teacher will ignore the very last answer you provided, even though it's correct, because the question said give 3, not to give 4. So this question sometimes throws people off because they're trying to give as many correct answers as possible, but that's not what they're asking. They want to know, can you limit your answers to what we are asking in the paper and simply state them? Now, if you had an example of this, like in my kidney diagram here, often they might say things like, name the artery that enters the kidney. Maybe they might ask you something like, name 3 processes that take place in the nephron of a kidney. There's an example, name 3 processes. Don't name any more processes than necessary. Next, we move into probably the most difficult question that you may see in an exam, and that is suggest. Now, suggest literally means you're going to provide an explanation or a solution. Now, at face value, this sounds very easy, but I will say that suggest is probably one of the hardest levels to do. And the reason for that is you have to have a huge library of knowledge in order to formulate an explanation or come up with a solution to a problem that has been posed to you that might not necessarily actually have an accepted explanation or an accepted solution at this point. And so often you see these in exams near the end of the exam. You see them perhaps at the end of a sub-question or the subtopic. And the mark allocation can range from 4 marks to 10 marks, yet again, depending on the difficulty of the paper and the grade level that you're in. Let's look at an example of a question of perhaps what they might ask. So our example question is, suggest a reason for the different colors observed in the peppered moths. Now, depending on what level of biology that you might be taking, this might be a very short answer because your knowledge is very limited. But as you go up in higher grades, you're going to have to give a very, very detailed answer. And what are we looking for here? Well, in this example, we are looking for a reason why our moths are 2 different colors, even though they're the same species, which perhaps they should be the same color. I think that's essentially what the question is asking. They should be the same color, but they're not. Why are they 2 different colors? And you are suggesting a reason why they are 2 different colors. And that then goes into a long explanation into evolution, natural selection, and a broader explanation of what was happening in the environment around these moths at the time of their color change. As you can see, this is a very lengthy answer with a lot of content and background knowledge that you would need. But yet again, these questions will be applicable to the grade level that you will be at and the knowledge that you are expected to have. Often these suggest questions are the ones that separate the people who perhaps get 90s from the 80s and 70s. Even though 80% is a really high percentage, sometimes only some students are able to give a full rounded answer for these suggest questions. They're definitely tricky. Last but not least, tabulate. Now, for some reason, this word throws off students sometimes, but tabulate literally means draw a table. And this links into some of the questions you've already done. Tabulate is a great way to present your answer in an easy to read format because you're going to read it right to left. And so let's say the question was tabulate the differences between bacteria and viruses. And like I said in differentiate, you need to make sure that it reads left to right. So bacteria are living, viruses are not living. Bacteria contain DNA and RNA, viruses contain either DNA or RNA. Bacteria can reproduce independently, whereas viruses need a host. As you can see, the answers read right to left. It's really important that you're able to do that. I'd like to point out that you may also be awarded a mark for giving your table a heading, and you'll be awarded a mark for actually drawing the table itself with the lines and the columns. And that's it for question words. I hope that you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful, especially preparing for your tests and exams. And I hope to see you all again soon. Bye.